The scent was the first thing that anchored you. It was a layered, complex perfume of aging paper, binder's glue, and the faint, acidic tang of fresh ink, all underpinned by the earthy notes of brewing coffee from the small machine behind the counter. This was the atmosphere of the last page, and for a leaner Ellie Vance, it was the only air she had ever truly learned to breathe. Her bookstore was a charmingly chaotic labyrinth tucked into a historic downtown district that was slowly, painfully, being squeezed out by glass-fronted chain stores and boutique juice bars. The shelves, made of dark, scarred oak her grandfather had salvaged from a defunct university library, groaned under the weight of their cargo. They bowed in the middle, creating gentle valleys of literature. There was no algorithm here. A first edition Hemingway might lean casually against a dog-eared contemporary sci-fi paperback. It was a space curated by intuition and love, not by sales data. Ellie, at 38, moved through the narrow aisles with a practiced grace. She had her grandfather's thick, unruly brown hair, which she perpetually tried to tame with a pencil, and her mother's sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to absorb everything. Today, she wore a faded t-shirt for a long-gone literary festival and jeans smudged with dust from the biography section. She was in the middle of her favorite ritual, hand-selling. "Oh, Mrs. Gable, I'm telling you," she said, pressing a slim volume into the hands of an elderly woman with a cloud of white hair. "You loved a gentleman in Moscow. This has the same heart, the same sense of finding a universe within a confined space. Trust me, Mrs." Gable peered at the cover through her bifocals. "But it's about a postman in Scotland." "Exactly," Ellie beamed. "It's about the small connections that make up a life. That's the whole point." The bell over the door chimed, a cheerful, slightly off-key sound that punctuated the store's quiet hum. David Chen walked in, shaking rain from his coat. He was a reporter for the local paper, a kind man with a perpetually curious expression who had started coming in a few months ago, initially for the coffee, but now, Ellie suspected, for the books. "The usual, Ellie?" he asked, his smile warming the space. "The darkest roast we have and a side of existential dread," she quipped, moving behind the worn wooden counter. "Just the coffee today. I'm on a deadline." He leaned against the counter, his gaze sweeping over the store. "It's a sanctuary in here, you know that. The rest of the world is all noise. This place, this is music." Ellie felt a familiar pang, a mixture of pride and anxiety. "Let's hope the landlord agrees." "Rent's due." It was a casual comment, but the weight behind it was immense. The store, her grandfather's legacy, was perpetually teetering on the edge of insolvency. Every month was a new battle against rising costs and dwindling foot traffic. Her grandfather had been a force of nature, a man who could charm anyone into buying a book. Ellie, for all her knowledge, was quieter, more introvert. She feared she was a poor imitation, a caretaker watching a beautiful thing slowly fade. "You'll make it," David said with an easy confidence she didn't feel. "This place is too important." She handed him his coffee, their fingers brushing for a brief moment. A spark of warmth shot up her arm, a pleasant distraction from the cold knot of worry in her stomach. "From your lips to God's ears." He was about to say something else when the bell chimed again. This time, it wasn't a customer. It was a courier, clad in a crisp corporate uniform that looked alien in the cozy clutter of the shop. He held a stiff, white cardboard envelope. "For a leaner Vance," he said, his voice flat and impersonal. "That's me," she said, wiping her hands on her jeans. He had her sign a digital scanner with a stylus, a small act of sterile modernity that felt like a violation of the store's analog soul. As she took the envelope, it was surprisingly heavy, bearing the logo of a prestigious Seattle law firm. "Looks official," David noted, his reporter's curiosity piqued. "Probably just the city complaining about the sign again," Ellie muttered, trying to sound nonchalant. But as the courier left and the bell chimed his departure, a strange silence fell over the store. The envelope felt cold in her hands, its sharp corners a stark contrast to the soft, worn edges of the books that surrounded her. It felt like a message from another world, and she had the sudden, chilling premonition that it was not bringing good news. Ellie waited until David had left, a good luck with the deadline call following him out the door, before she turned her full attention to the envelope. She slid it open with a letter opener shaped like a miniature sword, a novelty gift from her grandfather. The paper inside was thick, creamy, and impossibly expensive. The letterhead read, Wilhelm Crofton Bauer LLP. Her eyes scanned the opening lines. Dear MS. Vance, this firm represents Amazon Inc. The world tilted slightly. Amazon. Why would Amazon be writing to her? She continued reading, her heart beginning a low, heavy thrum against her ribs. The language was a dense forest of legalese, but the meaning was brutally clear. Hereby demand that you immediately cease and desist all sales and promotion of the publication titled Highland Watercolors by artist Angus McTavish. The cover image of said publication constitutes a willful and egregious infringement upon the copyright of the cover art for the Amazon-published ebook Misty Moors of the Mind. First published, Ellie's mind went blank. She stumbled out from behind the counter and navigated the aisles to the small, undervisited art section. There it was. Highland Watercolors. A slim, self-published book from a local artist who had passed away a decade ago. His daughter had asked Ellie to stock it on consignment. She desold maybe 3 copies in 2 years. As she pulled it from the shelf, the cover was a pleasant, amateurish watercolor of a foggy Scottish landscape. A hill, some mist, a lonely-looking sheep. She pulled out her phone and with trembling fingers searched for Misty Moors of the Mind. An image of the ebook cover appeared. It was also a foggy landscape, but it was a photograph, not a watercolor. The composition was different, the colors were different, the subject, while broadly similar, was entirely distinct. The only common element was mist and a hill. It was like suing someone for painting a picture of a pear because you'd once taken a photograph of an apple. The accusation was absurd. It was insane. She returned to the letter, her initial disbelief curdling into a cold, creeping dread. The legalese continued, escalating in its threats. It spoke of statutory damages, legal fees, and injunctive relief. It demanded she remove the book from her shelves, destroy any remaining copies, and provide a full accounting of the 3, maybe 4, copies she'd ever sold. The final paragraph was a thinly veiled threat of litigation that could, the letter implied, easily bankrupt a small business like hers. A wave of nausea washed over her. This wasn't a mistake. It was a threat. A giant, a behemoth that measured its profits in the billions, was pointing its colossal legal cannon at her tiny, creaking bookstore. Over a watercolor of a sheep. She sank onto a worn armchair in the poetry section, the letter shaking in her hand. Her first instinct was a primal scream of pure, unadulterated panic. They would crush her. They would bury her in legal fees before she even saw the inside of a courtroom. Her grand vision of fighting back, of righteous indignation, evaporated, replaced by the stark, humiliating reality of her own powerlessness. The store suddenly felt fragile, the shelves precarious. The books, her friends and protectors, offered no comfort. They were just paper and ink, flammable and vulnerable. She thought of her grandfather, a man who had faced down city councils and developers to keep this place alive. He had been a fighter, a charming bulldog. What would he do? The question brought only a fresh wave of despair. He would have known what to do. He would have called a friend, charmed a lawyer, laughed in the face of the absurdity. Ellie just felt small. The internal voice that always whispered she wasn't good enough, that she was just a steward of a slow decay, was now shouting. She had failed. She had let some tiny, insignificant book bring the apocalypse to their doorstep. She wrapped her arms around herself, the crisp, expensive paper of the letter crinkling against her sleeve. In the quiet sanctuary of the last page, surrounded by the ghosts of a million stories, Eleanor Vance felt utterly and completely alone. The next 2 days were a blur of quiet panic. Ellie put on a brave face for her customers, but inside she was adrift in a sea of anxiety. She called 3 different law firms. The first, a downtown corporate firm, quoted her a $500 consultation fee just to read the letter. The second, a smaller practice, listened to her story and bluntly advised her to comply immediately. You can't fight Amazon, the paralegal said, her voice full of pity. Nobody can. It's a business expense. Just do what they say. The third lawyer never even called her back. Defeated, Ellie sat in her grandfather's old office, a small, cluttered room at the back of the store. It smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, a scent she usually found comforting but which now only amplified her sense of failure. She was going through his roll-top desk, looking for an old invoice, when her fingers brushed against a worn, leather-bound address book. She flipped through the pages, a gallery of his life in looping cursive, friends, publishers, repairmen, eccentrics. And then she saw a name she vaguely recalled from her childhood, Arthur Pendleton. Underneath the name was a note, the only honest lawyer I know. Talks too much but knows everything. On a desperate whim, she dialed the number. A booming theatrical voice answered on the second ring. Pendleton, hello. Oh, Mr. Pendleton, my name is Ellie Vance. My grandfather was Frank Vance. Frank, of course, the voice erupted with warmth. A prince among men. A rogue and a scholar. How is the old bibliophile? He passed away, actually. 5 years ago, Ellie said softly. The line went quiet for a moment. Oh, my dear girl, I am so sorry. The world is a poorer place without him. And you're his Ellie, the little girl who used to hide in the history section. You've taken over the store, I trust. I have, she said, a lump forming in her throat. And I'm in a bit of trouble. An hour later, she was sitting in Arthur Pendleton's study. To say his home was filled with books would be an understatement. It was constructed of them. Books were stacked on floors, crammed into shelves that reached the high ceilings and formed precarious towers on every available surface. Arthur himself was a man who seemed to have sprung from the pages of a Dickens novel. He was in his late 70s, with a wild mane of white hair, a tweed jacket with patched elbows, and eyes that sparkled with fierce intelligence behind a pair of round spectacles. He had listened intently as Ellie recounted her story, his only interruption a periodic harumph of disapproval. He took the letter from her and read it, holding it at arm's length. His bushy eyebrows knitted together. Wilhelm Crofton Bauer, he mused. I know their senior partner. A man with the moral flexibility of a sea anemone. He read on, his expression shifting from academic interest to outright indignation. Copyright infringement over this, he scoffed, tapping the picture of the book on her phone. My dear girl, this isn't a lawsuit. It's corporate bullying. It's a nuisance suit of the highest order. He stood up and began to pace, his energy filling the crowded room. They know it's baseless. That's the point, they have an army of lawyers on salary. They file 100 of these a week. The cost to them is negligible. But the cost to you, the recipient, is catastrophic. They bleed you dry with legal fees until you capitulate. They're not enforcing a copyright, they're clearing the field of anything that casts even the faintest shadow. For the first time in days, Ellie felt a flicker of something other than fear. It was anger, but it was a shared anger. She wasn't just a hysterical woman overreacting. She was a victim of a calculated strategy. So what do I do? She asked, her voice small. Everyone I called said I should just give in. Arthur stopped pacing and turned to her, his eyes blazing. Give in to this legal thuggery? Frank Vance's granddaughter does not give in. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You came to me for legal advice, Elainer. And I will give it to you. We are going to fight them, but I can't afford pro bono. He cut her off with a wave of his hand. The honor is all mine. I've been moldering in retirement for too long. A case like this, it's a tonic for the soul, an intellectual puzzle wrapped in a moral imperative. This isn't about a watercolor, my dear. This is about the soul of the marketplace. And it's high time someone reminded these corporate Goliaths that David had a slingshot for a reason. He grinned, a mischievous, triumphant expression that made him look 30 years younger. Ellie stared at him, this magnificent, eccentric stranger who had just thrown her a lifeline. The knot of fear in her stomach didn't disappear, but for the first time, it was joined by a fragile, unfamiliar spark of hope. The next few evenings were spent in Arthur's book-lined fortress, fueled by tea and biscuits. They sat at his massive mahogany desk, a battlefield littered with law tomes and Ellie's meager business records. Arthur methodically dismantled Amazon's claim, dictating a scathing response letter that Ellie typed up on her laptop. He called their legal argument intellectually bankrupt and an affront to the principles of copyright law. This will put them on notice, Arthur declared, signing the printed letter with a flourish of his fountain pen. They'll see you have competent counsel and they may very well back off. And if they do? Ellie asked, the fear still a cold stone in her gut. Then we proceed to the next phase, he said, a glint in his eye. But as the days ticked by with no response, the initial rush of defiance began to fade, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. Complying was still the easy way out. The safe way. One evening, while waiting for Amazon's inevitable reply, Arthur was on a tear, pacing his study and ranting about the sheer audacity of modern corporations. They have no sense of history, no soul, They patent and trademark and copyright every stray thought, every combination of words, and then they lock it away in a vault. They want to own the language itself, but they forget their own pasts. They shed their skins like snakes, erasing any version of themselves that doesn't fit the current marketing brief. He paused, struck by his own thought. Their own pasts, he murmured, his eyes losing focus as he stared at a tower of books. That was the spark. What did they used to be? Ellie asked, catching his train of thought. Before they were everything, a bookseller, Arthur said, his voice laced with irony. Just a bookseller. What followed was a deep dive into the digital archaeology of Amazon.com. They spent hours sifting through old web archives, press releases from the 1990s, and forgotten interviews with a much younger Jeff Bezos. They were looking for a vulnerability, a crack in the corporate armor. And then they found it. On an archived version of the Amazon homepage from 1997, rendered in the clunky, text-heavy style of the early internet, was a slogan, proudly displayed beneath the now iconic logo. Amazon.com, Earth's biggest bookstore. There it is, Ellie breathed, pointing at the screen. Indeed, Arthur said, leaning in closer. A slogan they haven't used in, 25 years more? He stroked his chin, a slow smile spreading across his face. They abandoned it. They wanted to be the everything store. Being the biggest bookstore was no longer grand enough for their ambitions. He pushed himself away from the desk and walked over to a dusty shelf, pulling down a heavy, leather-bound volume. He blew a cloud of dust from its cover. The title in faded gold leaf read, Common Law Precedents in Commerce, 1880-1920. Modern trademark law is a labyrinth of federal statutes, he explained, flipping through the brittle pages. But beneath it all, like the foundation of an old house, is the common law. And the common law has a wonderfully simple, elegant principle for this sort of thing, trademark abandonment. He found the page he was looking for and read aloud. A mark shall be deemed abandoned when its use has been discontinued with intent not to resume. Intent not to resume may be inferred from circumstances. He looked up at Ellie, his eyes triumphant. They stopped using it. They showed every intent of never using it again as they expanded into selling everything from garden hoses to server space. By the old laws, the beautiful, simple old laws, that slogan has fallen into the public domain. Ellie stared at him, her mind racing to catch up. So anyone can use it, precisely, Arthur confirmed. So I could use it, the question hung in the dusty air of the study. It was a preposterous idea. A ludicrous, insane, beautiful idea. Arthur closed the book with a resonant thud. His smile was gone, replaced by an expression of grave seriousness, the kind of look a general gives before ordering a charge. Leaner, he said, his voice low and steady. These people have attacked your home. They have libeled your good name and threatened your livelihood over a phantom infringement. A defensive war is a war of attrition, one you cannot win. The only way to fight a bully is to punch them in the nose. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. We don't just defend. We don't just ask them to leave us alone. We attack. We countersue. We file a declaratory judgment action asking the court to affirm that Amazon Inc. has legally abandoned its original slogan. And we claim it for ourselves, Ellie's heart hammered in her chest. The audacity of it was breathtaking. It was terrifying. It was the single most insane thing she had ever heard. The last page, Arthur whispered, the vision clear in his mind's eye. Earth's biggest bookstore, it was the point of no return. A declaration of war. And as she looked at the conviction in Arthur's eyes and felt the first, true spark of her grandfather's fighting spirit ignite within her, Ellie Vance made a decision. She was going to do it. The decision, once made, settled in Ellie's soul with the weight and permanence of a foundation stone. The fear didn't vanish, but it was now alloyed with a steely resolve. For the first time, she wasn't just trying to survive, she was fighting for something. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind. Under Arthur's guidance, Ellie drafted the formal legal response to Amazon, rejecting their claims and attached their countersuit. The document was a masterpiece of Arthurian prose, citing 19th-century case law and accusing Amazon of corporate overreach and the malicious suppression of free commerce. Sending it via certified mail felt like launching a bottle rocket at a battleship. But the legal filing was only the opening salvo. The real declaration had to be public. That Saturday morning, before the store opened, Ellie stood on a stepladder on the sidewalk, a can of forest green paint in one hand and a brush in the other. Her hands trembled, not from the morning chill, but from the sheer, terrifying audacity of what she was about to do. Above the shop's name, the last page, was a blank space on the old wooden sign. She took a deep breath, dipped the brush in the paint, and began to letter. Each stroke was a commitment. BARTHS. The paint smelled sharp and clean. BIGGEST. Her letters were a little shaky, not as perfect as a professional's, but they were hers. BOOKSTORE. She climbed down from the ladder to look at her work. The last page, Earth's biggest bookstore, it was absurd. Her tiny, cluttered shop, with its bowing shelves and perpetually sticky front door, claiming the abandoned mantle of a global behemoth. It was a joke, a provocation, a poem. It was perfect. The act felt both terrifying and more liberating than anything she had ever done. She was still admiring her handiwork when David Chen walked up, a coffee in his hand. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes widening as he read the new slogan. Ellie, he said, a slow grin spreading across his face. What did you do? She told him everything. The baseless claim, Arthur Pendleton, the deep dive into Amazon's history, the 19th century law, the countersuit. His journalist's eyes lit up. This was more than the simple human interest piece he'd been expecting. This was a story. Can I quote you on that? He asked, his professional instincts kicking in. Can I write this? Yes, Ellie said, her voice firm. With Arthur's coaching, she had prepared for this. She explained her position, not as a victim, but as a defender of principle. This isn't just about my store, she said, hearing the echo of Arthur's passion in her own words. It's about the idea that words and ideas shouldn't be a corporation's private property forever. They used that slogan, they built their identity on it, and then they threw it away when it was no longer convenient. Does that mean no one else can ever use it, that it just belongs to their history vault? I don't think so. David was scribbling furiously in his notepad. And you're not afraid of what they'll do? I'm terrified, Ellie admitted with a raw honesty. But I'm more afraid of what happens if people like me don't fight back. The article ran on the front page of the local section the next day. It was a brilliant piece of writing, framing the conflict perfectly. Local David takes aim at corporate Goliath with legal slingshot. The story was picked up by the Associated Press. By Monday, Ellie's phone was ringing off the hook with calls from reporters from all over the country. The first shot had been fired, and it was louder than she could have ever imagined. In a sterile, glass-walled conference room high above Seattle, Benjamin Carter read David Chen's article on his tablet and sighed. At 32, Ben was one of the rising stars in Amazon's litigation department. He was sharp, pragmatic, and ruthlessly efficient. He'd been assigned the Vance case because it was supposed to be simple. A standard cease and desist, a quick compliance from a terrified small business owner, another file closed. Instead, his screen was filled with a picture of a woman in a paint-splattered t-shirt, standing proudly beneath a hand-painted sign that mocked the very foundation of his employer. The countersuit, which he had initially dismissed as the ravings of a madman, was now the basis for a national news story. His boss was not pleased. Crush it, Ben, was the simple directive. Make it quick and make it quiet. The response from Wilhelm Crofton Bauer was swift and brutal. A motion to dismiss the countersuit as frivolous, vexatious, and utterly without legal merit was the first document to land on Arthur's desk. It was followed by a deluge of discovery requests. They demanded decades of Ellie's financial records, every piece of correspondence she had ever sent, a full inventory of her store and her grandfather's business diaries. It was a classic attrition strategy designed to bury them in paperwork and rack up costs. The financial strain was immediate and acute. Even with Arthur working pro bono, there were filing fees, printing costs for thousands of pages of documents, and courier charges. Ellie started using her personal credit card to cover the store's expenses. The quiet anxiety she'd lived with for years had now become a constant, screaming panic. She'd wake up at 3 a.m., her heart pounding, the numbers not adding up in her head. Ben Carter flew in for the initial depositions. He was exactly what Ellie had pictured, impeccably dressed in a suit that cost more than her store's monthly profit, with a calm, confident demeanor that was more intimidating than any overt aggression. In the sterile conference room of a rented legal office, he questioned Ellie for hours. His questions were precise, designed to trip her up, to make her seem like a publicity-hungry opportunist rather than a principled defender. OMS. Vance, he said, his tone one of polite condescension, would you agree that your bookstore with its approximately 5,000 volumes is not in any literal sense Earth's biggest bookstore? It's a slogan, Ellie replied, her hands clenched in her lap under the table. Arthur had coached her for this. Keep it simple and tell the truth. It's not meant to be a literal statement of fact, but you can see how it might be confusing to the public, how it might dilute the brand identity that our client spent years building, the brand identity they abandoned 25 years ago, Arthur interjected smoothly. We look forward to discussing the finer points of that abandonment in court, Mr. Carter. Ben just smiled, a thin professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was calm, collected, the personification of the impersonal corporate machine she was up against. Leaving the deposition, Ellie felt exhausted and exposed. Ben Carter hadn't raised his voice once, but he had made her feel like an insect under a microscope. The battle had been joined, and she was beginning to understand the sheer, overwhelming power of the empire she had provoked. While the legal battle was a grinding, soul-crushing war of attrition, the battle in the court of public opinion was a wildfire. David's initial story was a spark, but the narrative, the quirky, independent bookstore owner using an archaic law to fight the world's biggest corporation, was pure catnip for the media. The story went viral. Cable news shows ran segments on it. Major newspapers wrote editorials. Tech blogs debated the intricacies of trademark law. Ellie became a reluctant celebrity. She did interviews via Skype from her grandfather's cluttered office, the backdrop of books lending her an air of scholarly authenticity. She was terrified every time, but she forced herself to do it, focusing on the story, on the principle, just as Arthur had told her. The most tangible effect of her newfound fame came from an unexpected quarter. One of her regular customers, a tech-savvy college student named Maria, set up a GoFundMe page with the title, "Help the Last Page Slay Goliath." "I just thought we could help with your legal fees," Maria told her a little shyly. Ellie was hesitant at first. It felt like asking for a handout. But then the donations started. A $5 contribution from a teacher in Ohio. $10 from a retired librarian in Florida. $20 from a small business owner in Texas who wrote, "Give em hell." The donations trickled in at first, then as the story was shared and reshared on social media, they became a flood. Within a week, they had raised over $50,000. Ellie cried when she saw the number. It wasn't just the money, which was a desperately needed lifeline. It was the messages of support, the thousands of people from all over the world who saw her fight as their fight. She wasn't alone. She had an army at her back. The public support made her a more formidable opponent, and it began to complicate things for her relationship with David. He was her biggest cheerleader, often staying late after the store closed to help her sort through paperwork or just listen to her vent. But he was also a journalist covering the story. The line between his professional interest and his growing personal feelings for her was becoming increasingly blurred. "You have to be careful," he warned her one night as they shared a pizza on the counter of the darkened store. "The media loves a hero, Ellie, but they also love a fall. Amazon's next move will be to try and discredit you personally." "Let them try," Ellie said, trying to sound braver than she felt. "What can they find? That I'm late on my rent? I hope that's all," he said, his expression serious. The warmth between them was undeniable, a welcome comfort in the midst of the storm. But his words were a chilling reminder that while she might be winning the public relations war, the real battle, the one that truly mattered, was still to come. And Amazon had not yet begun to fight. The preliminary hearing was set for a rainy Tuesday in federal court. It wasn't the trial itself, merely a hearing on Amazon's motion to dismiss Ellie's countersuit. But it felt monumental. It was the first time they would all be in the same room, arguing their case before a judge. The courtroom was a vast, mahogany-paneled space designed to make the individual feel small and insignificant. Amazon's legal team, 4 deep, sat at one table looking crisp and confident. Ben Carter at the head gave Ellie a brief, professional nod. At the other table sat Ellie and Arthur, who looked perfectly at home, his tweed jacket a splash of warm color in the somber room. Amazon's lead counsel, a senior partner from Wilhelm Crofton Bauer, argued first. His voice was smooth and practiced. He painted Ellie as a fame-seeking opportunist, her countersuit a frivolous and desperate publicity stunt. He argued that a historic slogan was an immutable part of a company's legacy, not a piece of abandoned property for anyone to claim. To allow this suit to proceed, he concluded, would be to invite chaos into the orderly world of intellectual property. Then it was Arthur's turn. He rose slowly, a gentle old professor, and walked to the lectern. He didn't thunder or roar. He told a story. He spoke of the common law, of how it was a living thing, designed to adapt and reflect a sense of fairness. He cited obscure, beautifully written rulings from the 19th century, when judges were as much philosophers as they were jurists. He argued that trademark law was not created to grant corporations eternal ownership of language, but to prevent confusion in the marketplace. Is anyone, he asked, his voice resonating in the quiet room, truly confused? Does anyone believe that this charming, independent bookstore in a small city is in fact the multinational corporation Amazon Inc.? Of course not. The only chaos here, Your Honor, is the chaos a multi-billion-dollar company seeks to inflict upon a small business owner who had the temerity to stand up for herself. He finished, and the room was silent. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Judge Miller, looked from Arthur to Amazon's lawyers. Then her gaze settled on Ellie. "OMS. Vance," the judge said, her voice unexpectedly gentle. "I've read your declaration, but I'd like to hear from you. Why is this so important to you?" Ellie's heart leaped into her throat. "This wasn't part of the plan." Arthur gave her a small, encouraging nod. She stood, her knees shaking. She clutched the edge of the table. "Your Honor," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "My grandfather built our bookstore with his own hands. He taught me that a bookstore isn't just a place that sells things. It's a community. It's a place where ideas are more important than profit margins." She took a breath, her voice growing stronger. "When Amazon came into existence, they called themselves Earth's biggest bookstore, and it was an exciting idea. But then they abandoned it. They moved on. But I did. People like me all over the country were still here doing the work. That slogan, it shouldn't belong to a company that doesn't want it anymore. It should belong to the people who are still living it." She sat down, her face flushed, her heart pounding. She had spoken from the heart. Judge Miller was quiet for a long time, looking at the papers in front of her. Finally, she looked up. "Oh, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice crisp and decisive. "I find Mr. Pendleton's arguments regarding the principles of common law abandonment to be compelling. And I find Ms. Vance's testimony to be sincere. This is not a frivolous case." She looked directly at Amazon's lead counsel. "Your motion to dismiss is denied. This case will proceed. I will see you all in court." A collective gasp went through the room. It was a stunning victory. Arthur squeezed Ellie's arm under the table. Outside the courtroom, they were met by a blaze of camera flashes and shouted questions. Ellie, blinking in the bright lights, felt a fundamental shift inside her. She was no longer just reacting, no longer a victim. She was driving this fight. But as she saw the furious, tight-lipped expression on the face of Amazon's lead counsel, she knew this victory had come at a price. They had embarrassed Amazon. They had won a battle. And in doing so, they had just ensured that the coming war would be merciless. The victory in the preliminary hearing was intoxicating, but the hangover was brutal. Amazon, humiliated by the public loss, escalated its tactics from legal attrition to open warfare. The quiet directive to Ben Carter was no longer to make the problem go away quietly. Now it was just go away. They hired a team of private investigators, forensic accountants who descended upon Ellie's life like vultures. They combed through 20 years of her business records, her personal tax returns, her grandfather's estate filings. They interviewed former employees. They contacted the city permits office, searching for any code violation, no matter how minor. Ellie felt like she was living under a microscope, every past mistake, every minor oversight, a potential weapon to be used against her. The constant pressure began to wear her down. The joy she once found in her store was replaced by a gnawing dread. Every customer could be a spy, every official-looking envelope could be another subpoena. Her burgeoning relationship with David stalled, the stress creating a chasm between them she didn't have the energy to cross. Meanwhile, Ben Carter's legal team was digging through case law with a desperation that matched their client's fury. And they found it. Not a cannon, but a silver bullet. It was an obscure ruling from a federal appellate court in a completely unrelated tech patent dispute. But buried deep in the footnotes of the 80-page decision was a paragraph of dicta, a non-binding judicial opinion, suggesting that the kind of 19th-century common law principles Arthur had built his case on were likely superseded by the more rigid modern framework of the Lanham Act, the federal statute governing trademark law. It wasn't a direct precedent, but it was from a higher court, and it was recent. It was enough. Amazon's lawyers immediately filed a motion for summary judgment, a legal maneuver to have the case decided by the judge without a full trial. Their argument was simple. Even if everything Ellie and Arthur claimed about trademark abandonment under common law was true, this recent ruling made it all irrelevant. The old laws were, the footnote suggested, no longer applicable. The motion landed on Arthur's desk like a tombstone. He read it, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, Ellie saw the fight go out of his eyes. "They've found a loophole," he said, his voice heavy. "It's a weak argument, an interpretation of a footnote, but with a conservative judge, it might be enough. They could win this before we even get to a jury." The news was a devastating blow, but it was followed by another. The landlord of her building, a risk-averse man spooked by the high-profile lawsuit and the investigators sniffing around, served her with a notice. Citing a clause in her lease about engaging in activities that could bring the property into disrepute, he was threatening eviction. It was all too much. The legal threat, the financial ruin, and now the loss of the physical store itself. That night, Ellie sat in the dark, silent bookstore, the eviction notice and Amazon's new motion on the counter in front of her. The weight of it all finally broke her. When Arthur stopped by to check on her, he found her sitting on the floor in the history section, sobbing quietly. "I've lost, Arthur," she whispered, the words ragged. "They've won. I've destroyed everything. My grandfather, he built this place, and I've driven it into the ground with my stupid pride. It was the lowest point. All seemed lost." Her case was in tatters, her store was on the verge of being taken away, and she was utterly convinced that her internal fear had been right all along. She was a failure who was not worthy of her grandfather's legacy. The fight was over. The day of the summary judgment hearing dawned gray and overcast, a perfect mirror of Ellie's mood. She walked into the courtroom feeling not like a fighter, but like a condemned prisoner on her way to the gallows. Arthur was by her side, his expression grim and weary, but he patted her hand reassuringly. "We state our case," he whispered. "We stand on principle to the end." Across the city, Ben Carter was straightening his tie in the reflection of his hotel room window. He had the winning argument in his briefcase. It was clean, efficient, and legally sound. It would crush Alina Vance and her quixotic lawsuit. And it was making him sick to his stomach. Over the past weeks, his view of the case had soured. He'd seen the outpouring of public support for Ellie. He'd read David Chen's articles and had been struck by her sincerity. Most damningly, in his own discovery research, he had unearthed the initial internal email chain that had launched the entire affair. The subject line was "Nuisance Competitor Local Press." The emails made it brutally clear. The original copyright claim was a manufactured pretense, a strategic move to intimidate a small, beloved local business that was getting positive press for being an authentic alternative to Amazon. They weren't protecting their copyright, they were squashing a narrative they didn't like. To win now, using a legal technicality to silence her, felt profoundly wrong. It wasn't justice, it was just an exercise of power. His quiet, quick assignment had become a moral stain he wasn't sure he could wash off. On his way out the door, he made a decision. He stopped by the hotel business center, printed one specific, damning email chain, and put it in a plain envelope. In the courtroom, Amazon's lead counsel laid out their case with clinical precision. He presented the appellate court ruling, dissected the footnote, and argued that the law, as it currently stood, was on their side. Arthur's entire argument, he concluded, was an interesting historical relic, but legally irrelevant. Judge Miller listened intently, her expression unreadable, but Ellie could feel the logic of their argument settling over the room, cold and final. As Amazon's lawyer spoke, David Chen slipped into the public gallery at the back of the courtroom. A hotel bellboy, paid $20 by Ben Carter, had just delivered the plain envelope to him at the courthouse entrance. Puzzled, David opened it. As he read the printed email, his eyes widened. He understood its significance instantly. It was the smoking gun. But how to get it to Arthur? The Amazon lawyer concluded his argument. The judge looked to Arthur. "Oh, Mr. Pendleton, your response." David knew he had only one chance. As Arthur began to rise, David faked a loud, hacking cough and dropped his entire satchel, its contents, notepads, pens, a tape recorder, scattering noisily across the floor. In the brief, irritated distraction, as all eyes turned to him, he slid the single sheet of paper to the end of the press row, where a fellow reporter with whom he'd shared tips for years subtly nudged it with her foot until it reached the edge of the aisle, right by Arthur's table. Arthur, annoyed by the commotion, glanced down. He saw the paper. He stooped to pick it up, his eyes scanning the first few lines. The weariness in his face vanished, replaced by a sudden, fierce blaze of light. He stood up and walked to the lectern, the email in his hand. "Your Honor," he began, his voice ringing with a newfound power that startled everyone. "Counsel for the plaintiff is correct. The law he cites is indeed the most recent interpretation. And it is entirely possible that this court may be bound by it." A murmur went through Amazon's legal team. Was he conceding? "However," Arthur continued, his voice dropping, "there is a legal principle far older and more fundamental than any trademark statute. It is the doctrine of unclean hands, the principle that a plaintiff who has acted unethically or in bad faith in relation to the subject of a lawsuit cannot then seek remedy from the court." He held up the email. "This is an internal communication from Amazon, dated the day before they sent their initial cease and desist letter to my client. I will submit it to the clerk as evidence." He read from it. "The copyright claim is tenuous, but her business is small. Legal pressure should be sufficient to achieve compliance. The primary goal is to terminate the plucky local alternative narrative she is generating in the press." The courtroom was utterly silent. Ben Carter stared at the floor, his face pale. His boss was staring at him, his expression a mask of fury. Arthur turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, Amazon did not come to this court seeking justice. They came seeking to crush a competitor. They manufactured the initial conflict with malicious intent. Their hands are not merely unclean, they are filthy. To grant them summary judgment now would not be an application of the law, it would be to make this court an accomplice to their bad faith litigation." Judge Miller's face was like stone. She read the email, her expression growing darker with every line. She looked up and her gaze was not on Arthur or Ellie, but directly on Amazon's lead counsel. Her voice, when she spoke, was ice. "This court," she said, "does not take kindly to being used as a weapon for corporate intimidation." She slammed her gavel down, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Motion for summary judgment is denied. Furthermore, based on the evidence of bad faith presented here, I am ruling from the bench on the defendant's original countersuit. Declaratory judgment is granted in favor of MS. Ovans. The mark in question is deemed abandoned. This case is closed." For a moment, no one moved. Then the courtroom erupted. Ellie stared uncomprehending as Arthur turned to her, a huge, brilliant smile on his face. "We won, my dear," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We well and truly won." The scene outside the courthouse was pandemonium. Reporters swarmed them, microphones and cameras thrust into their faces. Ellie, blinking in the sudden sunlight, leaned on Arthur for support, her mind still reeling. For the first time, she didn't shrink from the attention. She stood tall at the top of the courthouse steps and gave a short, impromptu speech, her voice clear and steady. She thanked Arthur, her community, and everyone across the country who had supported her. "This was never just about a slogan," she finished, "it was about the right to exist. And today we won that right." The news of the verdict and the dramatic, last-minute evidence of Amazon's bad faith exploded across the internet. News alerts pinged on every phone. By the end of the day, Amazon's stock had taken a small but significant hit, and the story of Benjamin Carter's resignation was leaked to the press. He became an unlikely hero in his own right, lauded for choosing ethics over his career. The falling action of Ellie's life was swift and joyous. Her landlord, mortified, called to personally apologize and offer her a new 10-year lease at a reduced rate. The GoFundMe, reignited by the news, swelled to a size that would secure the last page's future for years to come. Her little bookstore was suddenly the most famous independent bookstore in the world. She received calls from publishers about writing a book, from producers about movie rights. But the best part was the quiet return to normalcy, a new normal that was brighter than the old one. Months later, the last page was thriving. The store was always full now, a mix of old regulars and new pilgrims who had come to see the place that slayed Goliath. Ellie had hired 2 new employees to help manage the crowds and the booming online order business. She had become a reluctant but powerful voice for small businesses, a symbol of resistance in a corporatized world. She was no longer haunted by her grandfather's shadow. She had saved his legacy not by imitating him, but by finding her own strength, by learning to trust her community and to ask for help. She had faced down her deepest fears and had emerged stronger and more confident than she had ever thought possible. One crisp autumn afternoon, David Chen came into the store. Their relationship, no longer complicated by the roles of reporter and subject, had blossomed into a comfortable, happy partnership. He was carrying a long, flat package wrapped in brown paper. "For the store," he said, his eyes smiling. She unwrapped it. It was a beautiful, hand-carved wooden sign made by a local artisan who had been following her story. The letters were carved in deep relief from a single piece of dark oak. It read the last page, Earth's biggest bookstore. Later that day, Ellie stood on the stepladder once more. She carefully took down her own shaky, hand-painted sign and hung the new one in its place in the front window. It caught the afternoon light, the wood glowing with a warm, permanent sheen. She stepped back onto the sidewalk and looked at it. The store was bustling behind her, the sound of conversation and the rustle of turning pages spilling out onto the street. She saw Arthur inside, holding court in the history section. She saw David browsing the poetry. She saw a place that was safe, a place that was hers. She smiled a genuine, unburdened smile. She had not only saved her bookstore, she had found her voice, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was only the beginning of a new chapter.